In his role as a Vice President of the Royal Horticultural Society, James Alexander-Sinclair is at the Tatton Park Flower Show, helping to judge the Young Garden Designer of the Year competition. The 5 finalists are setting out on a path which James himself trod 40 years ago.
I, for the first 20 years of my life, thought that gardening was something really boring that my parents did. And then finally, you get it, and you realise the power that this thing has.
Encouraging new talent, blogging and vlogging from his garden in Oxfordshire, overseeing a busy design practice, and doing it all with endless optimism and humour, James Alexander-Sinclair is a human dynamo. But the quips and the jokes hide the thoughtful side of a designer who considers a brief carefully and lays out every new garden with an eye to the future.
We have to not just incorporate what you can see, but what is in the mind's eye. That's a sort of an illustration of the optimism of gardeners. You plant something under whose branches you will never sit.
James Alexander-Sinclair doesn't take himself too seriously and has been remarkably successful as a result. He writes with the fluency of the columnist and knows the value of a soundbite and a slogan. Gardens are mostly about sex, death and deliciousness is one he likes. How do you eat an elephant is another. Humour is one of the tools he uses to bring clients along with him in the design process, that toing and froing which is part of a garden designer's life. Another is his tablet. Like David Hockney, he's found a way to use modern technology to produce the art of the garden.
This has sort of changed the way that I work a lot. And it used to be an awful lot of paper and an awful lot of sort of, scrumpling things up and throwing them at the bin. And I used to have a basketball net above my waste paper basket. There was so much rubbish that went into it. Whereas now it's just this one thing, and it can be lots of different colours and different thickness of line, and I can sort of scribble on it. Sometimes my scribbles are quite difficult to understand, and I send them off to Emily, and she rings me up and said, "What on earth are you doing?" But it's just easy. You just sort of change it, and that combined with a conversation means that we can achieve almost anything.
For the couple who bought this plot in Northamptonshire, Polly and Giles Wilson, James Alexander-Sinclair has drawn a garden out of nothing. He did it at the same time as reworking a long-established typical English garden in the same county. The projects are only a few miles apart, and they sum up the two types of work that land on the desks of the nation's garden designers, adding to a mature garden or starting with a blank canvas. The Wilsons commissioned a new house designed by James Gorst Architects. It would be shortlisted for the RIBA House of the Year award. And they dialed up a completely new garden, for which they turned to James Alexander-Sinclair.
It's an almost sort of perfect illustration of the story of a garden design, basically, because I was there before the building was there, which is a really nice position to be in, because then you can sort of see how the whole thing evolves and see how the land lies. And so this was basically a field with an old barn on it that we'd taken down. So I first saw it, and the barn was basically stacked as a whole load of bricks, and the building wasn't there. And so I knew how the garden was going to go before the house arrived. And then you can sort of say, okay, how's this going to work? How's this going to hang on? And you can sort of see how the areas were going to sort of come together. And obviously, it all starts with a conversation.
There was an old farmyard, so it was a big yard that was derelict, hadn't been lived in for over 50 years, had left to ruin, and a big open field and fields, and big open space. Nothing of any value garden-wise at all. We'd already planned the house because we built from scratch anyway, so part of the planning process was to think about the landscape around it before we'd even started the build process. So it was an open page, I suppose, for the design.
This was a garden that came out of a field, and so the first thing we did was, there's a stream there, let's make a lake. No, let's make two, because that's much more fun. The stream came down to here, and we put a dam in at that point, and a dam in at this point, and suddenly, poof, you have lakes instead of streams. There are three things that one has to consider when designing a garden. The first one is the style of the house. If you have a sort of, oldie-worldy house, you don't want to do anything too modern against it because it will look ridiculous. Likewise, if you have a modern house, you don't want to suddenly start twining honeysuckle around the door because that will also look ridiculous. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, who's going to live in it? How are they going to use it? What's going to happen? If this is a very, very keen gardener living on their own, then that's one thing. If it's a family with two, rampaging children and 12 dogs, then that's a different way of looking at it. And the third thing is, what can you see from the garden? So how do you bring in the wider countryside? What you don't want to do is you don't want to put too much garden in the way of the view, because the view is the reason you put the house there in the first place.
There is something that Alexander-Sinclair does which sets him apart from many designers, or rather, doesn't do. He used to prepare a planting plan as part of the design, but he stopped, because so often when he was on site and the plants arrived from the nursery, he changed his mind about where they should go. But in the case of the Wilsons' house, although he didn't prepare a planting plan for shrubs and flowers, he did make a plan for the trees, which will eventually provide a spectacular setting for their new house as you arrive.
Here is the entrance. This is how we sort of come in at this point. I made it so we could actually drive a car right up to the front door. So you made it wide enough, but it doesn't look like a drive. So that brings us into this bit. Lots of parking around here. And this here, around here, this is basically the woodland. We planted a lot of trees. And this is the sort of long-term thing. And there's this vision that I can see in my head, but at the moment all the trees are small, so you can't see it yet. But what's going to happen if you come back here in 20 years' time is that you're going to drive down the drive and you're going to drive into a wood. And in that wood is going to be this extraordinary house. So that's where the imagination comes in. And this is one of the things about gardening, is that we have to not just incorporate what you can see, but what is in the mind's eye and what is in the imagination, what will come. And a lot of those trees, I won't live to see them. I won't live to see them get to what I imagine them to be. You know, big oak trees that in 100 years' time, and when I am well buried, will be huge, and that's what I want. That's what I want, and that's a sort of an illustration of the optimism of gardeners. And you plant something under whose branches you will never sit.
And that's the thing with an entirely new garden. You're thinking of the future, and of the views which are not there now, but will be in 20 years' time.
A lot of it is about this view that basically comes across here and this way. So it's about this view. So quite open and quite sort of empty here. There used to be originally a hedge line that ran all the way through the garden up here, and most of that has sort of fallen apart over the years, so we're left with these 3 big trees, and so we're looking in between these trees and off and away to the distant countryside. So all the action is close to the buildings, all the view is this way.
He's very modern when using his technology, and he's a great character anyway, and we get on very well with him. We discuss ideas, or if we've seen something that we like, we might ping it over to him on an email or a WhatsApp. You know, we quite like this idea. Maybe we should add this into this area, or should we add to that area? And we just work it along as we go. It's quite a fluid process.
Here are all the challenges a garden designer can face, straight out of the Garden Designer's Handbook. And perhaps the greatest of these is an exposed site.
This site is really windy. There is almost always a breeze. When I say breeze, it's often a gale coming across it. So we have to deal with that and try and work out how we're going to shelter everywhere from the wind. There are always snags and problems in any landscaping job, but that's part of the fun. It's part of the story. Again, you come to it, somebody rings you up and says, oh God, this is going to happen, and you say, okay, how are we going to solve this? How are we going to sort this out? We're going to deal with this. It's not a problem. Okay, so if we can't go that way, we go this way. So there is always a solution and a way through it, and it's managing to do that sensibly, to do it economically, and to do it with a smile on your face.
It's not a site for a formal garden, and we're not formal people. Everything planted here has been chosen very carefully by James and ourselves, and we really enjoy choosing the trees and how they're going to grow. And I suppose our children and our children's children should hopefully see the real benefit as opposed to us.
Lastly, how to cope with the transition between the designed garden and the wider landscape, a problem that's always there when you build a garden in the middle of nowhere.
There is a sort of process of gentle bleeding from one stage to another. If you stand here and the house is here, this is domesticity, this is man's domain, this is where we are. You can plant whatever you want around there at all. So you can plant plants that come from South Africa or Australia or South America or whatever, and you can make it look amazing provided it is around the house. The further you go away from the house and into the countryside, the less you can impose yourself. It's the idea of going from lots and lots of colour, lots of excitement by the house, maybe into shorter grass, maybe into longer grass, and then off and away and into the bucolic distance.
There is a theme to James Alexander-Sinclair's work as a garden designer. He has an overwhelming desire to promote the importance of gardens in the life of the nation. He does it through the Royal Horticultural Society, through his newspaper column, and by using social media. He's here, there, and everywhere, busier now than when he started designing 40 years ago, which happened by accident.
I left school, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I had a vague idea I wanted to be an actor. I had a vague idea I wanted to be a poet, but wasn't very good at poetry. I wanted to do something, I wanted to be discovered, basically, for being brilliant and a genius in something, and it never quite happened, unsurprisingly. And so I was living with my sister, and she said, get off the sofa, because I was basically lying on the sofa smoking cigarettes, because I thought somebody had to fill that void in the social structure, and that was my job. And she unsurprisingly got rather bored of this and said, for goodness sake, you need to do something. Why don't you go and dig the garden? And she had a little tiny garden, smaller than this. And so I went out there and I said, okay, and I sort of dug it, and I thought that's quite fun. I quite enjoyed doing that. And so it sort of snowballed from there. I then persuaded somebody else to let me dig their garden, and somebody else let me dig their garden, and somebody else let me dig their garden, and that is how it all began. So it sort of began by accident and by mistake, but I'm very, very pleased it did.
But there's a difference between digging a garden and designing a garden, though that skill too was acquired by hard work and by being a quick study.
I sort of tried to live life by saying yes to most things, and from the digging, I sort of slightly got above myself and decided I knew how to prune people's roses, which I didn't, and many people regretted allowing me loose with a pair of secateurs anywhere near that. But I sort of taught myself how to garden and how it sort of worked, and so we ended up, laying paving and building brick walls and putting down turf and digging holes and doing all of this sort of stuff that's important, and then learning slowly about plants. And the main premise behind my gardening in the early years is that if somebody asks you a question, then they don't know what the answer is. Therefore, if you say anything with enough authority and confidence, then they will believe you. So they sort of say, "What's that plant?" And you say, "Oh, it's a viburnum," and they say, "Really?"
James Alexander-Sinclair works from home, fashionable in these uncertain times, home being rural Oxfordshire. There wasn't much of a garden here when he came 6 years ago. He's been client and designer all rolled into one, in between working for others, and he's pleased with the way the garden's maturing. Most of his staff work remotely, and they're used to interpreting his initial sketches and the changes he makes to a design as he goes along, something he no longer does on paper, but on a tablet.
I am of an age where my computer designing skills are not up to snuff, and they're just not quite good enough. I'm quite happy with a piece of, old-fashioned tracing paper in a set square, but that's sort of rather out of date now. So I draw on an iPad basically, and draw lots of things, and I send it to Emily and Fiona, who work for me, and they make it into something that is comprehensible and make it look reasonable, and they send it back to me, and then I scribble all over it again and change things. So it's a process of me scribbling and them translating what I'm doing, and so eventually we end up with a plan. And some nice pretty pictures, and then I go back and I do more talking and waving my arms around and say, right, okay, this is how it's going to work, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that, and that bit's going to happen first, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do that, and try and paint the picture of this glorious thing that me and the client are going to create together. We make pretty pictures because many people can't read a plan. A plan is sometimes quite a tricky thing to do. It's like sort of map reading. It's trying to work out, okay, so which way up are we and which way round should it be? So it's a sort of, artist's impressions and things like that Fiona does beautifully. And so she takes the photograph and the drawing and we have conversations and to work out how it's going to do, and she comes up with something that the client then goes, wow, really? Is it going to look like that? And I say, better. Everything is always going to look better than the illustration is. That's what we're aiming for. So it's that which I guess is the sort of the visualization of what's going to happen and how it's going to work, and that's an important part of the trust, because an awful lot of the relationship between client and designer is actually about trust, in that they're giving you a big slab of ground and some money obviously in order to make this happen, and so they have to trust you, and they have to put they're sort of handing over something that they love very much into your hands, and they need to trust me to look after it and to make it beautiful and to make sure that I don't mess up.
Clients who've commissioned James Alexander-Sinclair will know that he has opinions, often rather strong opinions on design and on planting, and he's not afraid to voice an opinion on clients.
It's important that you like the person who you're working for. It's one of the things that I say to students when I'm allowed in front of them, which is occasionally, and I think it's really, very important, is that you should never, ever work for somebody you don't like, because it just won't gel, it won't happen, basically, and that if they don't like you, then they won't like what you do, and if they don't like what you do, then it's never going to be happy, and they probably won't pay your bill.
Polly Wilson did pay James's bills, but she was intrigued to hear that one of the judgments he makes about his clients at that first meeting is rather unusual.
So I go and have a look, and we walk around the place, and I judge them on the quality of their biscuits, and we look at the garden, and we sort of check things out, and we sort of check each other out.
I hope he's not judging my biscuits. No, you're absolutely right. He is very professional, but he's a great character at the same time.
Humour disguises serious intent, but there's no doubt that humour and optimism are two tools James Alexander-Sinclair uses day in and day out. For he has a romantic notion that every garden he designs tells a story.
You're telling a story that is part of the client's life, part of the life of the building around which you're making the garden, part of my life, part of everything, is that we're creating this sort of story. And all stories have ups and downs, and all stories have bits of drama and bits of tension in it, because it should be, otherwise it would be dull. But at the end, what you need is a story with a happy ending. And so that's where the optimism comes into the whole thing, in that I'm optimistic that once we start, we're going to end up with something that's going to be pretty special and to make people happy. What I want people to walk out into their garden and feel better, and feel their spirits lift. Occasionally you want them to walk out and you want their thighs to shiver with anticipation at the whole idea of having this garden, and the idea that they can walk and sit in it and play in it and live with it. And occasionally you get those sort of moments of earth-shattering, wonder, really, when the weather is right and the plants are just at that right moment and you're feeling in just the right mood, and you go out and you think, there is nowhere in the world that I would rather be than here.
The coronavirus pandemic meant a new emphasis on the idea of gardens as places which help our mental health. No garden designer needs convincing of this, but all of them like the idea that society is at last realising that man and nature have been disconnected for too long.
We have known for years, for decades, for centuries, for millennia, that if you go outside and you sort of sit there underneath a tree, or you're surrounded by gardening, or you go pull out a few weeds, or you do anything, it will make you feel better. And it's one of those sort of duh moments. Yeah, and tell me something that I don't already know. But what's rather fabulous is that now everybody else knows that too. And people have realised that, going out from your flat into a park, going and actually looking at a tree, just being surrounded, feeling the wind in your face and the rain on your head, all of that kind of stuff will actually make you feel better, rather than just sitting inside and feeling miserable. So it's not just changing where you are, it's going out and actually opening your eyes and realising that this isn't just green stuff. It's much more than that. It's something that can restore life. It's something that can make your soul sing.
A garden designer has to be dexterous. While the garden in Northamptonshire, created out of a vacant plot, occupied one half of James Alexander-Sinclair's brain, the other was occupied by a redesign of a long-established garden whose owners felt it wasn't making the most of its location and of the view.
It's an old rectory. It's been there for quite a long time. It's right next door to the church, very beautiful church sitting on top of a hill. The most striking first impression is that you walk there and there's this view that just goes off for miles and miles and miles. And you can see 180 degrees forever. So the garden comes along and then it goes woof down this hill, and it's sort of walled in really, and then off and away. The idea basically is to bring people into the garden and make them appreciate this view, to see this long thing. And then you think, well, if we do that, then there's no point in any garden at all, because all that garden is going to do is distract from the view. And so then we need to make a garden that leads you very gently to the view. So you walk from the front of the house and down these quite narrow paths, and where you can just sort of see glimpses of it. And then suddenly coming around, and then everything is about this way. It's pointing you in that direction.
Dealing with the view, in this case editing the view, is a challenge common to many garden designs. But for every view out, there is the reverse, the view in. Here, that view is of a scene which speaks of Old England. So radical won't work.
We have the church, which just sort of sits there in this sort of perfect English church with a graveyard surrounding it, lichen and moss-coloured graves, and then the rectory stands there, and you can sort of almost imagine the old rector coming out on a Sunday morning, having had his 2 boiled eggs and a piece of dry toast, to come and walk around to the church to minister to his congregation for sort of matins, and then coming back again. But what I hope we've got now is something much better than the rector, because the rector would have sort of come back and it would have been a little bit windswept, and he would go back into his study to write another stern sermon for the following Sunday. And here we've tried to bring in as much colour and as much excitement as possible, not just for us, not just for the people, because one has to remember that every time one plants something, you're actually inviting some other little bit of nature to come in and use it. So hopefully there are bees and butterflies and all of that sort of stuff going on too. So it's the idea of looking outwards and then turning around and looking back inwards, and the view coming back should be different to the view going out. This is the most intensive piece of garden. Closest to the house, most intensive planting. And everything is pointing in the direction of this view. So as you come down this path, it's saying, go that way. Come down this path, it's saying, go that way. You get to this rill, it's all that way, because this is where you end up, is on this bit here. And from there, you see across to the rest of the world. So that means that leaves us then with lots of space in here for big bed. Lots of plants in this area, lots of plants here, lots of plants just bracketing you in. Because the other thing about it is that we don't want the garden to be a one-trick pony. It's not just about this area, it's all about others. So there's another sitting area at this point here, which is more convenient for the kitchen. And then you come out and there's a little sort of enclosed area where you could stick a deck chair. And then this bit here is where it all begins to get a little bit wilder. So all of this is long grass and trees, because the ground just begins to tip away at that point. So it's tipping off this way and tipping off that way. And so everything is about going that direction. But you don't want it to be too abrupt. You need it to be a very, very gentle feeling. So rather than saying, this is where garden ends, this is where countryside begins, we just try and trickle it from one into the other as it disappears off into the distance.
Unlike the garden from scratch which James designed for Polly and Giles Wilson, this garden was established. But he could see straight away that, as well as dealing with the view, he would have to do something about the size of the herbaceous borders.
The beds weren't quite big enough. I'm a great fan of the generous bed, rather than having something sort of small and mean. Make it as big as you possibly can, because the bigger it is, the more that you can fit in. And I like plants. The reason, I didn't know when I started that I liked plants, but now I've realised that one of the most satisfying aspects of doing it is that in no apparent order, clients, places, plants. These are the reasons why I do what I do. And plants are a really important part of it, and the bigger the areas that you can plant in, the more stuff you can put into there, which means the more excitement you can get in. That means you can make it last longer, you can have more contrast, you can have more liveliness, and there's more reasons to make people stop. One of the things that I think is really important about gardens is that people don't just wander through them and say, that's nice, and keep walking. You want to make them stop. And so in this garden, you make them stop by the view. But I can take no credit for that. All I can do is say, look, view, nothing to do with me, enjoy that. Turn around, come back again. I can make you stop, hopefully, by, saying, oh God, what's that? And what's this? And oh God, that's rather fun. And there's this big thing in the back, and God, I like that colour. And that sort of thing. Even if you don't know anything about gardens, you don't care about gardens, I want to make you stop and realise that there's actually something rather exciting going on here.
The garden alongside the church needed careful handling. It's been here a long time, and experienced garden designers, like architects, know that it's possible to try too hard. James Alexander-Sinclair has always linked the trying too hard syndrome to first impressions.
One of the most important things is the fact that all the best ideas are the simple ones. Is that as soon as you start overcomplicating something, then it stops working. But if you look at it and you think, right, this is my first impression, this is my first idea, if we did that, we did that, we did that, that worked like that, this bit came around like that, bish bosh, job done. And then if you look at it again, then all you're going to do is make it more complicated. And as soon as you make it more complicated, it becomes less effective.
In architecture, a building is completed and the architect walks away. In the art of garden design, what the designer has set out is only the start. Trees and plants grow in unpredictable ways. Weather destroys planting schemes. Owners have a bright idea about creating a new feature. In other words, and like a building, a garden is alive. So it's a brave client who severs their relationship with the garden designer after the garden is first laid out.
I've been doing gardens for some people for over a decade, where we start and we do one thing at a time. Because again, like most people in their gardens, you don't do it all at once. Yes, you have the occasional one where they say, come in, sort it out, go away again. But I don't really like those. I like things that take longer, because it means that you change your mind and you live with something for a year, for 2 years, and you suddenly realize, actually, wouldn't it be nicer if we did it that way? And you can change things around. So a plan should be a constantly evolving thing, and it's something that sort of changes. Is a big part of people's lives, and the garden designer, or me anyway, I like to be involved with their lives. I like to know, who their children are, what they're doing, how this works, how they're going to use this piece of the garden, how they're going to use that piece of the garden, what are they going to do with the building, what's going to change, all of this sort of stuff. And you can't really do that on one visit, so it's nice to hang around for years.
As James Alexander-Sinclair whizzes around the country, designing gardens, lecturing, amusing audiences with his take on the designer-client relationship, he's developed a serious purpose, especially since he became a council member of the 200-year-old Royal Horticultural Society, whose gardens inspire so many amateur gardeners. Now he's a vice president and a frequent judge at RHS shows. At Tatton Park in Cheshire, he's one of those who must decide the winner of the Young Garden Designer of the Year competition.
Some of them are the best gardens I've ever seen, actually. They're people who've come out of there who do extraordinary work, and it's always very exciting to go along and see, because I'm an old buffer now, and what I want to see is young designers coming up and doing something different and doing something new and breaking new boundaries. And the more radical people can be, the happier I will be. There has to be a sort of haute couture as well as a ready-to-wear collection, and that's what we want to see from young designers.
At Tatton Park, the 5 finalists are at the beginning of their careers as garden designers. Winning here will, they hope, lead to other things. Freddie Strickland grew up in London, decamped to Cornwall, studied landscape design of the Eden Project, and has called his entry Tropic Garden.
This is a garden that celebrates Cornwall and gardens typically found in the southwest of England. With climate change in mind too, this garden asks the question what plants will be seen in southwestern gardens and also in gardens up north in the future too. The garden's designed for a middle-aged couple. It's part of a private area in the wider garden. Hopefully it envelops the seating area with planting and creates a green and verdant and beautiful, peaceful space. In the design, a reclaimed timber boardwalk meets a boulder, a natural boulder, and it was really difficult to try and get the two to meet and for it to be a very comfortable walkway through the space as well. But with a bit of head scratching, I think we got there just. I feel like it meets the brief, hopefully. I'll find out tomorrow when the judges award the medals, but for me I feel like it's a space that I want to be in. It's a planting that I love, and it's lovely to see it all come together.
From Ellie Edkins, a garden designer based in Bath, who started her practice just 1 year ago, the Dreamscape Garden.
It's all about being inspired by the surreal landscape of dreams and dreaming. It's kind of meant to be a fantastical and kind of conceptual approach to a show garden. I think my favourite bits are probably the pink sculptural elements of the garden and certainly the planting as well, I think. I've gone for plants which convey a kind of soft, ethereal and dreamlike atmosphere. We've got Ami Visnaga, which is giving a kind of cloud-like effect, and pops of pink with the echinaceas too. I was very nervous. I had to take myself on a little walk around the showground and just tried not to look in their direction. Otherwise you just get too caught up in kind of trying to read body language and stuff, which just isn't good.
Although they're young designers and it's good to encourage them, we have to take it seriously and we have to realise that they're going into quite a competitive and difficult profession, and so we don't want to sort of pussyfoot around, and we're not going to say, oh yeah, not everybody gets a lollipop, basically is the answer, and you have to earn it to be at an RHS show. One of these people, one of these 5, is going to be the Young Designer of the Year, and that is we hope that is the entrance to a glittering career.
Max Parker-Smith graduated from the Inchbald School of Design with distinction, designed a garden at Chelsea in 2019 and comes to Tatton Park with the Earth Garden.
I thought if I was going to create a show garden, how can I do it in the greenest way possible? I've got materials like the hempcrete blocks, which are hemp and lime mortar, K-bricks, which are reconstituted earth rubble. We've got second-hand metal edging, upcycled scaffolds, biodegradable furniture. A lot of it is, upcycled, second-hand or natural-based, basically. And I really wanted to show people that you can create a really stylish, crisp, contemporary garden using these materials. I suppose I wanted to give them a little bit of confidence to try these things out, because they're not the first thing that springs to mind when thinking about designing a garden. But I love what you can do with them, and I think they're just incredible materials that they deserve people's attention, really.
Amelia Balzega, who works in London and Copenhagen, has created a garden for a family of musicians living in a city.
The design came from me visiting a rooftop garden in Copenhagen, because I'm from Denmark, and I was looking into different styles of architecture that have a Scandinavian kind of background. And it was at the Music Conservatory, and there was all these different musicians rehearsing and playing in different rooms around this rooftop garden space. And as I walked through the space, all the different sounds kind of layered on top of each other. So I basically tried to recreate that experience visually using grids as a constant beat, and then different round natural details as like different tones in the garden. I've loved seeing it just come together as a whole, because I think it is quite balanced as a space. Like each part needs to be there for it to work as a garden, but I'm pretty happy with the water feature, because that was just a monster to put in, and yeah, that was the scariest bit, I have to say. And the walls as well, it's kind of like the backdrop for the whole space, so that was really important that it worked and that it is still standing. Show gardens are a whole other thing, so I still love designing gardens, and I think I will do show gardens. I need a little break, but it's definitely, as this is my first show garden as well, it's been such a learning curve. But I think now I'm more prepared for what it actually is and the hours and how much goes into it. So yeah, I'll do it again, but I just need a little break.
And finally, James Smith has addressed the matter of mental health, much talked about during the pandemic, and called his garden, "It's okay not to be okay."
I've always wanted to do a show garden. It's been my dream for a few years, so I've sort of had ideas in the background, and I've just sort of put them all together and came up with this design. We've created a path that leads to a sunken seating area, where it gives the opportunity for two people to sit down and talk through their issues with one another.
James got himself into trouble, hovering as the judges deliberated, and being politely told to go away.
I'm always looking at it going, that's not right, something's not, hopefully they don't pick up on this, but I think it's the first time that I've had a garden that's been judged by very, very talented other designers, so it's sort of like, I hope that they like it as much as I've done. Just the waiting process, I think, is killing everyone really.
The waiting is over. The RHS judges decide that Freddie Strickland's tropical garden tops their list, and he becomes the Young Designer of the Year.
This is the first time that many of them will actually have a garden that the general public, that people come and see and look at. It will definitely be the first time that they've had a garden that judges like us have come and looked at it and picked it apart and looked underneath every leaf and fiddled around the place in order to see exactly whether it's good or whether it's bad. So it's a tough thing, but standards are always high, and this year, particularly after the last couple of years, which has been tough, they've done really, really well.
In these young designers then, says James Alexander-Sinclair, is the future. For him, the designing continues, and he's in no doubt that he has the perfect job. For those who can't afford him, there's always his blog, full of witty remarks and unanswered questions, including, how do you eat an elephant?
Okay. What's the question? Is just how do you eat an elephant? How do you eat? I think that how do you eat an elephant is one of the great philosophical questions of life, really. In that, how do you eat an elephant one mouthful at a time? See exactly whether it's good or whether it's bad. So it's a tough thing, but standards are always high, and this year, particularly after the last couple of years, which has been tough, they've done really, really well.
In these young designers then, says James Alexander-Sinclair, is the future. For him, the designing continues, and he's in no doubt that he has the perfect job. For those who can't afford him, there's always his blog, full of witty remarks and unanswered questions, including, how do you eat an elephant?
Okay. What's the question? It's just how do you eat an elephant? How do you eat? I think how do you eat an elephant is one of the great philosophical questions of life, really. How do you eat an elephant? One mouthful. see exactly whether it's good or whether it's bad. So it's a tough thing, but standards are always high, and this year, particularly after the last couple of years, which has been tough, they've done really, really well.
In these young designers then, says James Alexander-Sinclair, is the future. For him, the designing continues, and he's in no doubt that he has the perfect job. For those who can't afford him, there's always his blog, full of witty remarks and unanswered questions, including, how do you eat an elephant?
Okay. What's the question? Is just how do you eat an elephant? How do you eat? I think that how do you eat an elephant is one of the great philosophical questions of life, really. In that, how do you eat an elephant one mouthful at a time?